Right on the mark. And Richard, it was terrific. Just what we needed to really get us off and running. I am so excited about the people who've come today. Many are old friends, some new, and some I've not yet met, but I hope that this will be an opportunity for us to get to know each other. This is truly a unique gathering. Hello, Philip. I hadn't seen you today. Old friend. So this is not your uncle's conference. It is going to be very different in a number of ways. And we'll start by even being in a different, if I could change places with you.
Sure.
I'm going to sit back here because I want you to be in a more meditative position. Focus forward and don't worry about the man behind the curtain. I think we're here today not to talk about pie in the sky, certainly not. We all have a yearning to prevent disease and not just treat it better. We are really looking for practical solutions for preventing disease, and that's why we've come today, and I believe that this is the best way we could get it started, a very interdisciplinary gathering of people. We needed to get all the stakeholders and the steak makers into the same room, eyeball to eyeball, ear to ear, to roll up our sleeves and to start charting the way forward. Now, we won't get too far over the next 2 days, as Richard has in effect said, but we will, I think, make some progress. And I hope that for each person, there will be some insights that will come out of this gathering, irrespective of what your discipline may be. Well, without further ado, as Stephen Covey recommended, let's start with the end in mind. And I'm just getting set up here. Most of you know something called metabolic syndrome. I don't want you to conflate metabolic syndrome with metabesity. I'll come back to the term metabesity in a moment, but metabolic syndrome is a good place to start because it could be viewed as a kind of proto-syndrome to consider as we chart the way forward towards its analog for metabesity. Now, as many of you know, metabolic syndrome is widely accepted and even promoted as a means of reducing cardiovascular risk. Metabolic syndrome consists of the components that you see before you, and these are easily measured, and thereby are a way to identify people at high risk for various interventions. Pharmacologic mainly, because as Richard has said, we have trouble with lifestyle approaches. They are so hard. And the overall intent of identifying folks with metabolic syndrome, of course, is to reduce cardiovascular adversity. And there might be some other benefits in besides cardiovascular adversity, but let's just focus on that for a moment. But by the way, you don't have to be generally obese to have metabolic syndrome. This is a very important point because the term, I'm afraid, metabesity, implies that we're sort of talking about obesity as the root cause of all these problems. It certainly is not. A little paunch, particularly if you're South Asian or North American Indian, may be all you need to qualify for metabolic syndrome. Well, how would we imagine a similar approach for metabesity? And here's one, it's a blur, I know, and you're saying something like an expression that my colleague and co-chair Larry Steinman taught me. It's this sequence, tryptophan, threonine, phenylalanine, which stands for, these are the amino acid one-letter abbreviations, WTF. That could be your reaction to that previous slide. So, yes, the approach towards this kind of metabesity syndrome looks very complicated, and for a number of reasons it would have to be. It could, however, be a simple interface using a report like this is from 23andMe, that would be understandable. And it would be accompanied by recommendations, an algorithm like the one you see here. And this is just a placeholder. This is not specifically designed for metabesity, but it could look something like this. And let me again say, I have not yet even tried to define metabesity yet. I'm being kind of sneaky about that. But let's back up a moment. There is the opportunity and the risk that we could seize on some early wins for metabesity, whatever that is, taking advantage of the evolutionary progress that has pushed some molecules up to the position of being candidates for preventing metabesity. And while many pharmaceuticals have been called for this purpose, few have been chosen. One possible example is my favorite drug, metformin, which is the best example of a molecule that is probably safe enough to be given to a large, well population as a means of preventing major disease. And you'll certainly be hearing more about metformin over the next 2 days for slowing the process of aging, as well as targeting other metabesity components. The reason we can say that metformin is safe enough is because it has been used for 6 decades as treatment. Now, first-line treatment for type 2 diabetes. We know a lot about the drug safety profile. It's not perfect, but it's good. The American Diabetes Association practice guidelines recommend that metformin even be used for preventing type 2 diabetes in people who are pre-diabetic. Though my former division at FDA has thus far not been willing to add this indication to metformin's drug product label, despite what I think is abundant persuasive evidence. Now, in my opinion, there is currently no other drug other than metformin that is quite ready for type 2 diabetes prevention, particularly a low-risk, large population. We, for example, don't yet have evidence for putting a 32-year-old on an SGLT2 inhibitor with only a family history as the sole risk factor for type 2 diabetes. An SGLT2 inhibitor could increase the risk of osteoporosis and thereby add to the need for additional medications and cost and risk of different sorts, and we would not know exactly what we were preventing in a patient, in a consumer who is healthy. At least one SGLT2 inhibitor has been shown to reduce cardiovascular risk in type 2 patients. As you can see here, this is from the IMPA-REG trial showing the SGLT2 inhibitor produced by Lilly that actually resulted in a survival benefit. However, it's very important to point out that these folks who were in this study were at very high risk of cardiovascular disease. And for demonstrating the benefit in a pre-diabetic or even in a healthy population would be very difficult if you look at the risk of the general population. So this gives you some sense of the challenge of demonstrating a benefit, at least on survival, in a general population, and particularly if this were 30-year-olds, it would be almost a flat line. Statins are also a favorite drug of mine, and they've been proposed as another drug that should be used in most adults, even those with normal cholesterol levels. However, we're now understanding that there is some downside to statin use. It's not a completely perfect class of drugs either. We're seeing even that diabetes risk is increased by use of statins. That's not enough to keep us from using statins, even in people with diabetes. In fact, it's the standard of care. Statins, on the other hand, may reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease, although there are some data that suggest that it may not work the same way. There is a drug approved for Alzheimer's, by the way, that has just been shown to improve insulin resistance in patients with metabolic syndrome. And this is an example of the kind of cross-purposing that we've been doing with already long-used drugs. But let's back up to metformin. I have an interesting story about this chemical class from whence metformin comes. The story teaches an important, relevant point. Some of you have been around long enough to recall a metformin classmate, fenformin. Fenformin was designed to be more potent, a more potent version of metformin, and indeed it was. By the addition of this phenylethyl side chain, the drug became much more partitioned in the mitochondrion than turned out to be a good idea. This made fenformin a mitochondrial poison, and the result that fenformin caused a high rate of the often fatal condition, lactic acidosis. Long story short, fenformin is the only drug that was summarily removed from the market by FDA. There's never been another drug removed by FDA in this manner. Drugs are typically taken off voluntarily by the manufacturer. Because of fenformin, many experts strongly believe that FDA should never allow another biguanide to be used in the U.S. CEDAR director Janet Woodcott and I had to do a lot of hand-holding of critics, both internal and external, to enable FDA to join the rest of the world in approving metformin for diabetes treatment. Now, here is my point. We have metformin today poised as a potential metabesity agent because we were a lot more lucky than good. Who would have thought that a naturally occurring molecule on the market for 70 years would come to this position? It really has all been sheer dumb luck. Now, there is a danger, particularly with metformin, that we have overpromised and will underdeliver. We do have some hard evidence that metformin can reduce the progression of prediabetes to type 2 diabetes, but it's a very modest effect. And as Richard has implied, it's even less than what happens with lifestyle intervention that is carefully supervised. We have some evidence that metformin can reduce CV risk, but it's weak. There is some evidence that metformin can reduce cancer risk, but it's essentially epidemiologic evidence. There's evidence that metformin decreases dementia and Parkinson's disease risk, but there's also contrary evidence that metformin might actually increase the risk of dementia. And let me just make a quick point here that I've been talking about pharmacologic approaches to meta-obesity, but increasingly, and I think as Richard has helped us to understand, it's not going to be pills alone or even at all that we depend on for preventing meta-obesity. It will take a large tool chest of apps, social change, education, as well as some things that we do put in our mouth or don't put in our mouths to make the difference. So I'm coming back, having given my spiel sort of backwards, starting with the end in mind, but finishing with where one would usually start, that is to define the key term. And I'll take a stab at it, and I hope that we'll refine it over the course of the next 2 days. And maybe we'll even change the term a little bit. Metabesity does have that connotation of dependence on obesity. Maybe we should call it metadesity. But metabesity, I would say, is the constellation of major chronic diseases and the aging process itself, which increasingly appear to have common metabolic drivers. And of course, there are other important drivers, but metabolism, and let's call it a metabolopathy, is the tie that binds these conditions together. I started off talking in the back of the room for a few reasons. One of them is to make the point that to really get at the stretch goals of preventing multiple serious diseases and the age-related decline itself, and to do that in a very young, well, and large population, we are not talking about your uncle's model of disease risk reduction. We have to work outside the box of the Framingham heart study, which has been a marvelous way of learning about preventing cardiovascular disease. Targeting the prevention of cardiovascular disease is a success story, though it continues to be a story in progress. Diabetes and obesity prevention is a no-brainer, but it is not nearly as far along as what has happened with CVD prevention in the 7 decades since the FHS began. There are equivalents of the Framingham heart study now underway in the metabesity realm. But like the FHS, these new study programs will run for decades and cannot take the place of the kind of long-term interventional trials you're going to hear about today. It is my strong belief that science, clinical practice, health product development, and most importantly, our species will benefit if we come out of our professional silos and look for opportunities to prevent or reduce the risk of these conditions together. Let me conclude by emphasizing that science and technology are maybe the easier parts of this. The even more challenging parts are, how do we get evidence for putting people like these on some kind of product or products or non-products? How do we get resources to pay for getting that evidence? Joe Cook is going to come back along with Ed Saltzman to really drill down into these areas later in the conference. But I wonder, can we imagine a product like this? Could we even target the age process with a pill that you put in your mouth? We today are taking a few steps on a long journey and adventure under a banner that may help us to organize, connect, energize, and enable us to contribute to the audacious goal of substantially reducing the occurrence of chronic disease and the pace of aging itself. Most of us here, particularly me, will not live to see the complete fruition of this quest, but we can enjoy the journey, starting now. Thank you very much.